They told me the ranch would kill me slower than a bullet and cheaper. 40 acres of cracked ground out past the dragoons, a dead well, and a house with a roof that let the stars in. The man who signed it over to me was bleeding out in a card room in contention, and when he pushed the deed across the table, he laughed, actually laughed, like he'd finally found somebody dumb enough to take the curse off his hands. Worthless, he said, but it's yours now, gun hand. God help you. Everybody in that territory agreed on one thing. That land wasn't worth the paper it stole. They were wrong. Every last one of them was wrong, and the reason they were wrong is the reason I'm telling you this instead of lying in the dirt beside the men who came looking for it. Because that ranch had a secret. An old one. Older than the deed, older than the town, older than the guns we all wore like second names. And when I found it, when a boy with a busted arm and a grandmother sharp enough to skin me alive showed me what the dead earth was hiding, I understood why the last owner laughed. He didn't leave me a worthless ranch. He left me a choice, and out here a choice like that gets people buried. Stay with me, I'll tell it slow the way it happened, and I'll tell it true, even the parts I'm not proud of, especially those. The first thing I did on my own land was nearly shoot a 9-year-old. He came out of the rocks behind the collapsed corral at dusk, quiet as smoke, and my gun was up and cocked before my brain caught up with my hand. That's the trade for staying alive as long as I had. The hand moves first, and you spend the rest of your life apologizing to it. The boy froze. Skinny arms, a shirt that had been white maybe 2 owners ago, and a right forearm bound in a splint of yucca stalk and rawhide. He didn't run. He didn't cry out. He just looked at the barrel of my Colt the way you'd look at a rattler you'd already decided you couldn't outrun. And then he looked past it, at me, like he was measuring whether I was the kind of man who did the thing his hand had started. I wasn't most days. I let the hammer down slow. My thumb was shaking, and I hated that it was shaking, and I did the thing I do. I pulled my father's watch out of my vest and wound it. 3 turns. It doesn't run. Hasn't run since I was 17. The hands are stuck at 411, and I've never once bothered to find out why. But the crown turns, and the little clicks it makes are the only sound in the world that has ever slowed my heart down. Click, click, click. The boy watched me do it, and his face changed. Not softer, exactly, but curious, the way a cat gets when the thing it feared turns out to be stranger than dangerous. "You live here?" I asked him. He didn't answer. I found out later he spoke English better than I did. He was just deciding I didn't deserve it yet. That was my welcome to the Vance Ranch. I hadn't even slept a night under what was left of the roof, and already I'd learned 2 things the townsfolk hadn't told me. 1, the worthless land wasn't empty. 2, whoever was on it had gotten very, very good at not being seen. Let me back up, because you're owed the shape of me before I ask you to care what happens to it. My name is Elias Vance. Eli to the 2 or 3 people still alive who liked me. I came up hard in the nooses country, learned to shoot before I learned to read, and by 25 I had a reputation that walked into rooms a half-second ahead of me and made honest men find business elsewhere. I'm not going to pretty it up. I killed men for money. Some of them needed killing. Some of them just drew slower than I did, and the difference between those 2 categories got blurrier every year until I couldn't see the line at all. The watch was my father's. He was a farmer, a soft-handed failure of a man who loved dirt that never once loved him back, and he died owing money to people who took the farm and left me the watch because it was broken and worth nothing. I've carried the one worthless thing my whole life. Make of that what you want. I've had a lot of time on trail to make something of it myself, and I never landed anywhere good. By the winter I'm telling you about, I was 38 and tired in a way that sleep didn't touch. My hands were starting to argue with me on cold mornings. I'd begun to notice young men in saloons looking at me the way I used to look at old shootists, like a milestone they meant to pass. Every gun hand knows the arithmetic. You don't retire from this. You just lose one day the once, and the loss is permanent. I wanted out before the arithmetic came due. I didn't know how a man like me got out. And then a dying gambler shoved a deed across a table and laughed, and I thought a ranch. Land. The thing my father died reaching for. Maybe that's the door. So I rode 2 days to look at my door, and it was 40 acres of the most hopeless ground God ever forgot to finish. Sun blasted. The well, when I dropped a stone down, it gave back a dry knock. No creek. No tank. The kind of place where the cattle die standing up and don't have the courtesy to fall over. In town, they told me, grinning, all of them grinning, that 3 men had owned it before me and all 3 had left broke or dead. You can't run cows without water, mister, and there ain't a drop out there. Boyd's tried to buy it cheap for years just to round out his range, and even Boyd won't pay but 2 bits an acre. Worthless. Worthless, there's that word again. I want you to hold on to it, because a lot of blood got spilled over how wrong it was. The boy came back the second morning with the old woman. I'd slept in the house, I used the word loose, and woke to the smell of wood smoke that wasn't mine. I came out with my gun and my coffee both, which tells you how I ranked my priorities, and there they were at the edge of the dead corral, the boy with his splinted arm, and beside him a woman so old and so straight-backed she looked carved. Apache. Chiricahua, I'd learn, though the word most folks used for her people around there was a slur I won't repeat, and she wouldn't have dignified. She wore a faded army-issue coat 3 sizes too big, and she had a face like a dry riverbed, all cracks and history, and eyes that took one look at me and did the arithmetic faster than any saloon boy ever had. "Put the gun away," she said, in English, flat. "If you were going to shoot children, you'd have done it yesterday. My grandson says you shook too much anyway." I have been called many things by many people. I don't know that anyone before or since ever knocked me back on my heels quite that clean. I put the gun away. Her name, she told me eventually, and only because I asked 3 times, was something I could not say right and she got tired of correcting, so she let me call her Nolene, which is close, which is the best my mouth could do, and which she pronounced after me every time like a woman watching a dog try to open a door. The boy was Dash, her daughter's son. His parents were dead. She did not elaborate, and I did not push, because there are things you learn not to push at, and the flatness in an old Apache woman's voice when she says dead in the year of our Lord 1881 is one of them. I knew some of what her people had come through. Not all. Enough to keep my mouth shut. They'd been living on the ranch. In it, on it, around it. A thing I couldn't quite fix in place, because every time I thought I'd found their camp, it turned out to be a place they'd been and left. They knew this dead ground the way I knew the inside of my own gun. And they'd been here through 3 white owners, invisible because, she said this plainly, chewing it, the last 3 men had been fools, and fools don't look down, they look out at the horizon dreaming of cattle they can't feed, and a person can live a long time in the blind spot of a dreaming fool. And me, I said, what am I? She looked at me a long moment, the wind moved the big coat on her small frame. You, she said, look down, you've been looking at the ground since you got here. She wasn't wrong. I'd been reading the dirt the whole time, old habit. A gun hand reads ground the way a preacher reads faces. That makes you either smarter than the others, she said, or more dangerous. I haven't decided. Here is the part where you'd expect me to tell you about the secret. I found it the 4th day, and I'm going to make you wait a little longer because the finding of it wasn't the point. The point was Dash's arm. The splint was going bad. I'm no doctor, but I've set enough of my own bones on the trail to know the smell of a brake that's turned. And on the 3rd evening, sitting near the fire they'd finally let me sit near, I smelled it. The boy was running a fever, sweating in the cold. And Nolene, this woman who had walked through the end of her whole world with a straight back, sat by that fire with her jaw set so hard I could hear her teeth. Because the arm needed a doctor, and the nearest doctor was in a town that would sooner set a dog's leg than hers. And she knew it. And I knew it, and Dash knew it, and none of us said it. I want you to understand that I did not decide to be a good man that night. I have never once in my life decided that and had it hold. What happened was smaller and meaner and truer than a decision. I looked at that boy, the boy whose first act on meeting me was to not run from my gun, sweating and quiet and trying so hard to be no trouble, and something in my chest that I'd spent 20 years training to stay dead rolled over in its grave. "Contention's got a doctor," I said. "Half a day's ride, I'll take him." "They won't touch him," Nolene said. "They'll touch him," I said, "if the man standing next to him is me." She looked at me. She understood exactly what I meant, that a reputation like mine was a currency, and that I was proposing to spend it. That the doctor wouldn't help an Apache boy out of kindness, but would help him out of a very reasonable fear of the man who'd carried him in. It was an ugly thing to offer. It was the ugliest, truest thing I had. And to her everlasting credit, she did not thank me for it, because there was nothing in it to thank. She just nodded once, and started getting the boy ready, and somewhere in the packing she said, without looking up, the thing that broke my life open. "There's water," she said. "You should know before you spend yourself on us. In case you decide we're not worth what it costs you. This land you think is dead. It isn't. There's water enough on it to make you the richest man in this valley, and every man who's ever owned it died not knowing, and we let them die not knowing, because the day a white man finds water on his land is the day my grandson has nowhere left to disappear. The fire popped. Dash watched me with fever-bright eyes. I'm telling you, she said, because you're about to bleed your name white to save a boy who isn't yours, and a person who'd do that has a right to know what he's standing on. So now you know. You can carry him to contention and come back and take your fortune and run us off, all legal, all yours. Or you can be a fool like the others. I've told you the truth. What you do with it is the only thing about you I don't already know. I stood there on my worthless ranch in the cold, with my father's dead watch in my pocket and a fevered boy between me and a fortune. And for the first time in a long time, I wound the crown without meaning to. I got the boy to contention by noon, and I did the ugly thing exactly as I'd promised. The doctor was a florid, careful man named Prout who took one look at the Apache child in my arms and started shaping the word no with his soft mouth, and I set Dash down on his table gentle as I could, and then I let Prout get a good look at me instead. At the gun worn low and easy. At the face he may be half recognized from a description on a wall someplace. I didn't threaten him. I never said a word about it. I just took out my father's watch and wound it, click, 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 and watched him, and let the quiet do the arguing, and he swallowed, and he set the boy's arm. I hated it. I want to be honest about the shape of the hate. It wasn't hate for Prout, or even for myself, particular. It was hate for a world where the only key I had that fit that door was fear, where a boy could only get his bones set straight if a killer stood in the corner reminding a healer to be afraid. I'd spent my whole life learning that fear was the only thing men reliably paid attention to. That afternoon, I paid full price for the lesson, and it tasted like rust. Dash didn't make a sound the whole time Prout worked, and Prout worked well once he got going, cleaned it, reset it, splinted it proper in wood and plaster. When it was done, the boy looked up at me and said the first full sentence he'd ever given me, in English clean as a schoolteacher's. You didn't have to be scary. He was already going to say yes. I saw it. No, I said, he wasn't. He was, Dash said, with the terrible certainty of a child who has spent his short life learning to read exactly how much danger a room holds. You just scared him before he could be brave. Grandmother says the same about a lot of white men. They break the thing right before it can grow. Out of the mouths of babes. I paid Prout in silver and we rode home, and I thought about that the whole way. They break the thing right before it can grow. And I thought about a fortune sitting under dead ground. And I understood I had ridden all the way to contention and back without once making the choice she'd laid at my feet. I'd only postponed it. She showed me the water 3 days later. Dash was mending. The fever had broken on the ride home, and by the 3rd day he was underfoot in the good way, following me while I patched the corral, asking 100 questions, showing off a coyote's skull he'd found. Nolene watched us the way you watch weather. And on the 3rd evening she simply stood up from the fire and said, "Come." And I came, and Dash came, and she led us out into the part of the ranch I'd written off first. A jumble of red rock at the northwest corner, a dry maze of stone the surveyor's map called unusable, the kind of broken country you ride around, not through. She knew a way through? Of course she did. A crease between 2 walls of rock so narrow my shoulders brushed both sides, angling down, the light going blue and then dark, and the air, this is the thing I'll never forget, the air got cool. Cool and damp in a country where damp is a rumor. My whole body knew what that meant before my mind would say it. The crease opened, and there it was. A pool, set in stone, fed from below, still and black in the last of the light and clear as glass when Dash knelt and cupped it up to show me. Sweet water. Cold. A spring that had never once known a dry year because it came from somewhere the sun couldn't reach, deep under the dragoons, and it welled up here in this hidden throat of rock and had been welling up. She told me since before her grandmother's grandmother, since before there were white men to call the land above it worthless. There was old sign all around, grinding stones, char, the ghosts of a people who had lived here and been driven off and left this one secret buried behind them for the children who might someday need a place to disappear. Enough water, Nolene said quietly, to run 1,000 cattle, to sell to the railroad. To make you a king in this valley, Elias Vance. Boyd would pay you more for this than you've made killing men your whole life, and he'd pay it gladly, and he'd never once ask what happened to the 2 Apache who used to live on the land. I knelt by the pool. I put my hand in it. Cold went up my arm like a truth I'd been avoiding. Why, I said, why show me this? You could have let me sell you the land above it and never know. You'd have been rid of me and kept your secret. Because you carried my grandson to a white man's doctor and paid for it with the only thing you had, she said. And a person who does that is owed the truth, even the truth that ruins him. I don't do you a kindness showing you this. I put a stone in your hands and I make you carry it. Now you can never again say you didn't know. That's what I've done to you. That's the price of what you did for him. We're square. What you do next is between you and whatever you pray to. Behind her, Dash drank from his cupped hands and watched me over his fingers with those steady eyes. The trouble came for us before I'd finished deciding. The way trouble always does, it doesn't wait for you to be ready. It waits for you to be split. Harlan Boyd rode in 4 days later with 6 men. I knew who he was before he opened his mouth. You always know the Boyds. He was a big, soft-looking man gone hard in the places that matter, dressed like a banker, mounted like a general, and he sat his horse in my yard and looked at my patched corral and my mendied roof with the mild disappointment of a man who'd expected to find the place abandoned and profitable, and instead found it lived in and inconvenient. Mr. Vance, he'd done his reading, he knew my name and the weight it carried, and he wore it easy, which told me he had 6 men because he thought he might need them, not because he was afraid. Boyd was never afraid. That was the whole trouble with Boyd. Heard the new owner had a reputation, didn't expect him to fix the place up. He said it like a small betrayal. Man doesn't mend a roof, he means to sell. Maybe I mean to stay. On this, he laughed, and it was the dead gambler's laugh all over again, the whole valley's laugh, the laugh I was getting tired of. Vance, there's not a drop of water on 40 acres. I've had my eye on this dust patch for a decade, only to square my line. I'll give you $500 for it, cash, today, and you can ride out of this country a solvent man, which is more than the last 3 owners managed. $500 for land he thought was worthless, and I stood there and I did the arithmetic Nolling had put in my hands, because Boyd wasn't offering $500 for worthless land. Nobody rides in with 6 guns to buy worthless land. Boyd suspected. Maybe he'd found old sign, maybe he'd heard something, maybe he was just a man whose nose for money never quit. But he suspected there was more here than dust, and the $500 was a bet, cheap money against a fortune he couldn't prove. And here's the thing I want you to sit with, because I sat with it a long time. In that moment I could have sold. I could have taken his suspicious $500, or I could have shown him the pool and let him bid me up to 10,000, 20, whatever a spring like that was worth to a cattle king, and I could have ridden out solvent and free and done with it. Done with all of it, the guns and the killing and the arithmetic finally, mercifully closed. The door I'd come here to find would have opened. My father's ghost would have had his farm at last, paid for in a currency that dead, soft-handed failure never understood. Water. All I had to do was let one old woman and one boy become the thing Boyd would never once ask about. It's not for sale, I said. I felt Nolling go still somewhere behind me in the house. I didn't look. Boyd's mild face didn't change, and that was the frightening part, because a man whose face doesn't change when you tell him no is a man for whom no is just the first word of a longer negotiation, one that ends somewhere other than words. You'll want to think about that, Boyd said, pleasant. This is dry country, Vance, hard on a man alone, fires start, stock strays, accidents find the stubborn. He gathered his reins. I'll come back when you've had time to remember you're a gun hand with no water and no friends, camped on the one patch of ground I've decided I want. That's not a good thing to be out here. Ask the last 3. He rode off with his 6 men, unhurried, and the dust of them hung gold in the afternoon light long after they were gone. And Dash came and stood beside me in the doorway with his mended arm and said, quiet. He knows, doesn't he, about the water? He suspects. Then he'll come back. Yeah. The boy was quiet a moment. Then, you could have sold, you'd be rich. Grandmother said you would. She said most men would. He looked up at me, and there was something in his face I hadn't earned and didn't know what to do with. Why didn't you? And God help me, I didn't have an answer for him. I'd said it's not for sale the way my hand comes up before my brain, the true thing moving first, and the mind left to catch up and make sense of it after. I stood in the doorway of my worthless, priceless ranch and reached for the watch and wound it and told the boy the only honest thing I had. Ask me again, I said, after Boyd comes back, if I'm still standing to answer. Boyd came back on the 7th night, and he didn't come to talk. I'd been waiting for it. You don't survive 20 years at my trade without learning the rhythm of a threat, and Boyd's accidents find the stubborn had the rhythm of a man who'd already decided. The 7 days were just courtesy, or maybe patience, letting the fear do to me what fear does. But I'd spent those 7 days too. I'd sent Nolling and Dash up into the rocks by the spring, the one place on that whole ranch a man could hold against odds, the crease so narrow a single defender could bottle it. I'd argued with Nolling about it. She'd wanted to stay, wanted a rifle, and she could shoot, I don't doubt it. But I told her the truth. If it went bad, the boy would need her to get him out through the back country she knew, and I didn't, and a dead grandmother is no use to a live boy. She'd looked at me a long, flat moment and then done the arithmetic and gone. She left me her rifle anyway. "Since you'll be needing two," she said, and that was as close to a blessing as I was ever going to get. They came with fire like Boyd had promised. I smelled the coal oil before I saw the torches, 6 riders spreading in the dark to burn me out, to make the accident that finds the stubborn, and Boyd himself hanging back on the rise the way his kind always does, close enough to watch, far enough to be somewhere else when the questions got asked. I'm not going to give you the fight beat by beat. I've noticed that men who weren't there love the details and men who were there mostly don't. I'll tell you it was fast, and it was ugly, and it was the thing I'd come to this dead ground specifically to never do again. And I did it anyway, well, because I was very, very good at it. And because there was a boy in the rocks who'd asked me why didn't you sell, and I wanted to still be alive to give him a better answer than a dead man's silence. 2 of Boyd's men went down in the first exchange, by the corral in the light of their own dropped torch. A 3rd I put down by the well. The fire caught the house. My mended roof went up like it had been waiting all its life for the excuse. And I fought in the light of it from the rocks, moving the way you move when the moving is the only thing between you and the ground. And somewhere in it, I took a bullet through the meat of my left shoulder that I didn't feel until much later, the way you don't. It came down at the end to Boyd and me. His men were done dead or run, and the house was burning and he'd come down off his rise because a man like Boyd can't quite believe, even at the end, that the world will actually make him pay, and he faced me across my own burning yard with a pistol in his soft, hard hand, and that mild, disappointed face lit orange, and he said, "All this over dust in 2 apache. You could have been rich, Vance." Honest bewilderment. He truly didn't understand, and that was the whole of Boyd right there, that he'd stood on the edge of understanding his entire life and never once stepped over. "You could have just sold." "I know," I said. And here is the moment, the heavy one, the one I've turned over every night since. Boyd was beaten. His men were gone. He had a gun in his hand, but I was faster. I had always, my whole cursed life, been faster, and we both knew it, standing there in the firelight. I could kill him clean and call it self-defense, and no law in that territory would blink. A gun hand burns out a squatter. A squatter's hired killer dies in the fire he set. The book's close, and Boyd goes in the ground and takes his suspicion about the water with him, and Dash grows up with his place to disappear intact, and I would only have to carry one more dead man, and what was one more on a strip of leather already full. That was the smart killing, the clean, quiet, permanent solution. Everyone I'd ever ridden with would have done it without a breath of hesitation. It would have solved everything. I looked at Boyd over my father's gun, and I thought about a boy in the rocks saying they break the thing right before it can grow. And I thought about all the men who'd drawn slower than me over 20 years, and how the line between the ones who needed killing and the ones who just lost had blurred until I couldn't find it, until I couldn't find myself in it. And I understood with a terrible, sudden clarity that if I killed Boyd here, beaten, unnecessary, for convenience, I would have come all this way. Found the door I'd been dreaming of, and walked back through it into the exact same room. "Drop it," I said. "Right out. Tell whatever law you own that your men and I had a disagreement and lost. You leave this valley, Boyd, and you never come back, and that spring stays a rumor you couldn't prove. Or draw. I'll bury you next to your fire setters and sleep fine. Your choice. But I'm done killing men just because it's tidy." For one long second I thought he'd draw. I saw it move behind his eyes, the arithmetic, the disbelief. Then Harlan Boyd, who was never afraid, who I'd have sworn couldn't be, looked at my face in the firelight and found something there that finally scared him, and it wasn't the gun. He dropped the pistol. He backed to his horse. And he rode out of that valley, and so far as I ever heard, he never did come back. I don't tell you that because it was brave. I tell you because it was the hardest thing I ever did with a gun in my hand, which was not use it, and because I have never once been sure I did the right thing, and I want you to sit in that unsurety with me, because that's where I've lived ever since. The house burned to the ground. My whole fortune of a home, such as it was, gone to ash by morning, and me sitting in the cold light of it with a hole in my shoulder and my father's watch in my hand, winding it, click, 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 4:11 forever, and no roof left to let the stars in because there was no roof left at all. Nalin came down from the rocks at dawn with Dash. She looked at the ashes, and she looked at the 3 dead men, and she looked at me bleeding on the ground, and she did not say anything wise, because she was a real woman and not a story, and real women faced with ruin mostly just get to work. She dug the bullet out of my shoulder with a heated knife and a steadiness that told me it wasn't the first bullet she'd dug out of anyone. And while she worked, Dash sat by me and held the watch, turning it over and over in his mended hand, studying the stuck hands. "It's broke," he said. "Yeah. Why do you keep it?" I didn't have the fever as an excuse. I was clear-headed and hurting, and the sun was coming up over the dragoons, over the hidden water and the dead ground, and the ashes of the last thing I'd ever try to own. And I found I could finally answer him. The why didn't you sell, the why keep a broken thing, all of it the same question wearing different clothes. "Because it doesn't have to work," I said, "to be worth carrying." The boy thought about that. Then he handed it back and said with the flat certainty of his grandmother, "That's stupid." And then softer, deciding, "But you can stay, if you want. There's water, you know where. We'll show you how to live small enough that the fools riding by never look down." He glanced at his grandmother. She didn't stop working on my shoulder, but she didn't say no. Out here, that was a yes. So that's the secret of the worthless ranch. Everyone in that territory was right about the water and wrong about everything that mattered. They thought the secret was a fortune, and it was, and I turned it down, and I've never been solvent a single day since. I live small in the rocks near a spring most men will die never knowing about, with a woman who tolerates me and a boy who's nearly grown now and shoots better than I do on my cold mornings. My hands argue with me most days. The watch still doesn't run. But the boy grew. That's the thing I've got instead of the fortune. I didn't break it right before it could grow. Whatever else I did in this life, and it's a long, dark strip of leather, that list, and I'll answer for all of it. There is one boy in these mountains who got to grow, because a killer looked down at the dead ground instead of out at the horizon, and found something there worth more than water.